So, Dune Part 2 is coming out this week, and I have to tell you, it is rare to see a movie with this much consensus around it. It's pretty much unanimous that the movie is a triumph. Today on the podcast, how Dune Part 2 managed to win over all the critics. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. I mean, look, when Denis Villeneuve made the first Dune movie, he took a massive risk. He told half the story with no real guarantee that the second part would be greenlit. Well, not to spoil that part for you, but it was greenlit. Dune Part 2 opens in theaters this Friday.
This world is beyond cruelty. You've been fighting the Harkonnens for decades. My family's been fighting them for centuries. They were massacred alongside my father.
Your father didn't believe in revenge.
Okay, so the reviews are glowing, and it's, I think, a testament to Denis' lifelong obsession with the story. This is a sci-fi epic that is set on the planet Arrakis, and brilliant performances that we got here by an all-star cast that includes Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Austin Butler, and Rebecca Ferguson. Rad, Simonpillai, and Rachel Ho have both seen it. And look, we try usually on the show to find a range of viewpoints, but like almost everyone else who's seen it, they're both on the same page. They loved it. Rad, Rachel, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. First of all, I just got to say, Rad, I'm used to you being grumpy. I'm used to you not liking stuff. I feel a little bit disoriented. The world is off its axis because you liked this movie. Tell me about it. How much did you love it?
I mean, look, like this might be my favorite Denis Villeneuve movie.
Wow.
And that, I think, is saying a lot.
Wow. Okay.
And
right.
and here's the thing, right? Because it's like with Denis Villeneuve
You've seen Arrival,
movies,
bro? Okay, continue.
I've seen Arrival,
yeah.
but that's the thing. Like all of his movies, I've always been awestruck by his movies, but also there's always been something that nagged at me. Like I always felt like they never stuck the landing. But again, awestruck by his movies because this guy, he's a very operatic filmmaker. Like he'll point a camera at a tree and like, it's a tree, right? And I'm like, dude, it's a tree.
Yes.
Like that's, but so I feel like Dune, like now that it's all clicked into place, like I feel like it feels like the perfect match for his very operatic sensibilities. And I feel like, you know, a lot of the ideas he's been working throughout his career in movies like Arrival, in movies like Sicario, in movies like even Encendies, I feel like they've all kind of come together in this movie. And so when I say like, I think he stuck the landing with Dune 2, I don't just mean he stuck the landing for Dune. I feel like he stuck the landing for his whole career. Like he might as well just quit now while he's ahead.
Oh, okay. Wow. Not I was like, oh, Rad, how much did you love it? And you're like, he should never make another movie again. This is his best work. Rachel, what about you? How much did you love this movie?
I loved it, but I would like to see Denis continue to work. That's just my personal thing. I would love to see him continue to work.
Yeah.
I think it's just the perfect blend of that operatic visual storytelling with the quieter stuff that he did in Canada before, like Polytechnique, Maelstrom. So I love that there's just this nice blend between the two. And it's such a difficult book to adapt. And like people have tried many times in the past. I think he absolutely sticks the landing on this one. I agree with Rad. To be clear, though, I do want Denis to continue to making films. I think we deserve more Denis, and I think he deserves to share his gift with the world even more.
I want to get into that thing that you just mentioned, this idea that this has kind of been a difficult story to make. Like, I mean, people have been trying to make a good Dune movie for forever. I think for a period of time in the middle of the 70s, there was a movie that was going to star Salvador Dali and Mick Jagger, which is just like a wild sentence to say out loud. Finally, you get, you know, the David Lynch movie, 1984-ish, 1985 maybe. And that's a mess. Everyone sort of acknowledges it's a mess. Lynch is like, I don't even want to have my name out on this thing. And then you get into Denis, and Denis wants to adapt it. What kind of risks do you think he was taking when he was choosing to adapt this, Rachel?
I mean, a massive risk because he's a director that doesn't really have a bad movie. You could say like you could have minor quips with different films and different aspects of his film, but I wouldn't say any of his movies, like I would take anyone down that says that he has a bad movie. I don't think any of his films are bad.
100%.
It doesn't. But this film, like you just said, there has been a track record that hasn't been overly successful. I want to defend David Lynch, though. He's given like a bit over 2 hours to make a movie that requires, 10 plus hours. So I don't really.
Rachel, you're waking up in the morning and defending the David Lynch Dune? That's the choice we're making today?
For David Lynch's Dune here. I don't think it's as trash.
She also wants 10 hours of Dune, by the way. How did you miss that part?
But it's a really difficult story to adapt just from all the different houses that are involved.
Yeah.
The different worlds that you have to depict. It's crazy. It's really, really difficult. And I think he absolutely did it to perfection. And you said it in your intro, this is something that's been an obsession of his. And I think that care and that thought really does come through.
One of the difficulties of adapting Dune is that, like, do you adapt the first 3 books, which are mostly set in the same world, or do you adapt, a larger, wider view of the world, which I think by the end of the series, the time jump is like thousands of years into the future. I mean, like, this is just like a large, expansive universe based on the novels. But there's something to be said about choosing sort of a smaller moment and focusing on that. Rad, when you reviewed part 1, you were one of the few critics who didn't like it. A bunch of people like that movie, and then Rad was like, no, I don't know about this. And that is a Rad that I know and love. But how do you think Dune Part 2 succeeds where maybe Part 1 failed?
Well, I mean, like, if you go back to what I said back with Dune Part 1, I was like, I was really, really into it until, like, the last act, where it really felt like it was kind of meandering and searching for a conclusion, really, right? And it was the thing is, like, there was so little story in that first part because they were setting everything up for all the conflict that happened in Dune Part 2. So for me, I was like, this is hubris. Like, how is Denis Villeneuve with such little story making me sit here for more than 2.5 hours? And by the way, I then watched it 3 more times after that. So, like, you know where to shove my opinion.
Of course.
But in retrospect,
part
like,
2.
it was all worth it. Yeah, Part 2, like, made it all worth it because, like, now that all the things were in place, now the story clicks in, the plot clicks in, like, everything comes together. The whole story just basically comes into focus, and it's like I get it, and I could finally see what the story was really about. I could finally see that this is actually a story that is very influenced by Lawrence of Arabia, as Denis Villeneuve has actually mentioned in the past. I mean, This is essentially, like Paul Atreides is Lawrence of Arabia in space, and so the idea that this story was actually about a white savior who is not actually the savior he thinks he is, that like, where he's actually just an agent of the oppressors, like that. I fell in love with that, but it only came through in the second part.
So let's give people a little bit of the context of the story here. Paul Atreides is a duke in exile, and he finds himself living among the Fremen, and the Fremen look to him and they go, oh, maybe you might be the prophet that we've been waiting for. And he sees how much power he has, and he decides that he's going to, lead them into battle against the oppressors that they have, but maybe also for his own ends. That's the rough general plot line of the Dune that Denis decides to tell. Talk a little bit about the break in Part 1 and Part 2, because I do think you're right. Something about Part 1 felt unsatisfying in the sense that we were finally arriving at, like, okay, now the conflict has begun at the end of Part 1.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I think, if you could have watched Part 1 and actually thought it was a white savior narrative.
I see.
Right? Like, it's like here's a character that embedded himself with this indigenous community, feels like he's going to help fight the oppressors alongside them when he comes from the family of oppressors who is in league with oppressors. He's coming from a world where it's power plays between these colonialists, and he's joining this indigenous community to fight back, right? And again, so it's like, like, by the end of the movie, it's like, I am going to join forces with you. That's it. Like, that was a contained story. I think there was hints of where this was going. There was obviously hints at where the story was going to go. Yeah. But it's only in Part 2 where you just start dealing with the Messiah complex. You start dealing with Paul Atreides' own hubris. You start seeing kind of his entitlement in all of this, and you start seeing how he's still just a cog in a colonial machine.
Okay, I want to come back to that in just a moment, because actually I think that in itself is very rich, fertile ground. But let's talk about a little bit about the acting, Rachel, because there's a lot to be made of the casting that they made, in this movie. Timothée Chalamet, a rising star. Austin Butler, a rising star. Zendaya, who's been around for a long time. She is in the first movie, what is essentially like a single frame, right? Like, we advertise Zendaya is in Dune, and then you show up and it's like a perfume commercial. Like, she's just standing in the desert for 45 seconds, and then the first part ends. How is the acting in the second one? What do you make of the performances here?
It's such an interesting thing to have a film like this where you have a collection of they're not younger, but like they're not young.
They're the contemporary sort of.
They're younger, yeah. They're the ones who I kind of look at them like they will inherit Hollywood as long as none of them do anything kind of egregious in their careers in the
future
next
is
little
theirs.
while.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
It's theirs. It's theirs for the taking. And it's so cool to have a film that has them all in it. And so you have Austin Butler playing this menacing villain who he does it really, really well. And it's such a departure from the Elvis from, Masters of the Air, where he's this, suave captain boy. Like he's actually really, really fit for the role. And I think
he's not doing the Elvis accent for
doors.
once, which is kind of nice, Yeah.
It's not there. Masters of the Air, it's still there.
Yes,
people are like, it's not there. I'm like, it's there.
Yeah.
He's not Elvis in this one, though.
Yeah.
And then, Florence Pugh, who's not in it for very long, but her role is so important in the film, or in the story, I should say, generally speaking, in the books. And she's not in the movie for very long, but the way she plays it, and I think that's a testament to her talent as well, is you can feel the importance of her character. You can feel where it could go with her, unlike Zendaya in the first one, which, she's just in there for a few seconds. But she did the press tour, which was...
Yes, she did.
That's what was
trooper.
important for that one, yeah. So it's amazing to see this kind of collection of actors coming together and being... All of them are like, they're across the board. They're all performing at a really high, and you can understand why these are going to be the ones who will eventually be, the generations, the Tom Hanks, the Tom Cruises, the Meryl Streeps of the next 20 some odd years.
Rad, quickly to you, what do you make of the performances in this movie?
I mean, look, like I think, when you're an actor in a Denis Villeneuve movie, you have to be great to compete with the sound and fury of it all, right? I mean, like my theater was trembling with this movie, and it's like, and meanwhile, I'm weak in the knees because of Rebecca Ferguson. Of course, this cast is stacked. Like they have so many greats: Rebecca Ferguson, Josh Brolin, even in like the itty bitty roles, right? Where you got like Palme d'Or winner Léa Seydoux shows up for a scene to seduce someone and then gone, and like Florence Pugh's in the margins of the story, be like, "Hey, Timothy, remember when we were Little Women together?"
Yes.
Like that's how stacked this cast is.
Yes. There is something that's really compelling to me about the way that they've organized this movie to be this sort of powerhouse of, all this sort of relevant talent at the moment, and then sort of be quiet about it. I think like there's something to be said about the fact that there isn't a current, if you will, Tom Cruise level star in this movie. It is just all these younger generations. Rachel, do you see this movie as a kind of like a passing of the torch moment?
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it. I think so. It's almost like Denis welcoming them in, Denis pulling them together and saying, because it's saying welcome. And they've all done really, really well before this.
Yeah.
But it sticks really with me that they're all just in the same movie at the same time. Denis is always able to get the most tremendous performances out of everybody. It's in the same kind of vein as, in my opinion, a Chris Nolan, where even the smallest role is played by big stars, but they all make an impact, and you understand why the highest talents are playing a sideline role in it. And because it makes the film better collectively, when you put them all together, it just makes for a really interesting tapestry of different voices that are coming in. And I can't say enough things about that.
If you're just joining us, this is Commotion, and my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Ride Simonpillai is here, and Rachel Ho is here. We're talking about Dune Part 2 because it has its big Montreal premiere tomorrow night, and then it opens in theaters everywhere on Friday. Right, I want to go back. I want to go back to the thing that you mentioned about white saviors, and maybe let's talk about a little bit of the context, the larger socio-political context that this movie is landing in. How overt do you think are the parallels between the situation in the Middle East right now and then the sci-fi world that is happening in Dune that has been created, of course, long before this current conflict?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think anytime we're watching a story about colonizers and their power plays oppressing this indigenous community in the desert that is then trying to rebel and fight back for their freedom. I mean, you shouldn't be ignoring the parallels that has to the current conflict in the Middle East. But I think it's interesting because you said this current conflict, like the Dune was written way before this current conflict, but the current conflict has this history going back at least a century, which is part of Dune's DNA. Because, as I said, Dune is essentially a remake of Lawrence of Arabia, right? And that is the influence here. That's where Herbert took the Paul Atreides character from. If you look at Lawrence of Arabia, that is about this British soldier's role in the Arab revolt. It's about how the British kind of worked their way in and aligned themselves with the Arab revolt in Palestine and Sinai. And that's how they ended up taking control of that territory. So that history is very much part of what sets the stage for the current conflict today. And so that history is in Dune's DNA. So whether the filmmakers are ready to address it or not, their movie is very, very relevant to what is going on right now.
I'm glad you brought up Lawrence of Arabia because, first of all, two significant things. One, Lawrence of Arabia is, of course, a significant movie in and of itself. But
one of the greatest ever.
One of the greatest movies of all time.
Yes.
But then, of course, it's also based on the real-life story of T.E. Lawrence because he wrote this memoir of his time as a British soldier who not led, but he convinced the Arabs to rise up against the Turks. And then he ended up kind of writing this memoir of saying, I feel like I maybe exploited these people and feeling like he's not quite British, but he's not quite Arab. And this is like a trope that we see over and over again. Like the idea of the maybe a person with a lot of power or could have a lot of power sort of embedding themselves with a bunch of people who don't have that much power and then leading them in a way. You see this in The Last of the Mohicans. You see this in The Last Samurai. You see this in Avatar. Like this is sort of a recurring trope. But the thing about Dune that is kind of interesting and different, and I'm talking here about the novel, is that it is supposed to be a subversion of this. It's supposed to be a subversion of whether you're able to pull this off at all. Do you think Denis' version, or do you think Denis' landing point in part 2 actually gives you that, we should actually question this white savior narratives? Maybe I'll go to Rachel on this one and then Rad.
I think it does. It's very overt in terms of, Zendaya's character, Chani. She's the one that's really vocalizing, why do we need him? As a generate, his people were the ones who wrote the Messiah prophecy. So why should we believe him when they say this, it happens to be our person, happens to be the Messiah, And I think when he puts those arguments forward, I do think because it is in a very obvious way as well.
Okay.
It's not subtle.
It's explicit.
It's very, very explicit. But I think that in a sense, audiences kind of need that sometimes, where it's just really put out there. One side is put out there, the other side is there. Then you have Paul in the middle, who's kind of weighing his options. He understands, where Chani's coming from,
sure.
But he also obviously knows his history and he knows his bloodline's traditions and what they're going for. But I do think that it is, and it's a bit adapted as well, I would say, to from what the novel was. I think the novel looks almost more at class warfare a little bit more.
Yeah.
But the casting is very purposeful. Timothy is a very pale young man.
Very
he's a
literal,
very white guy.
Yeah.
And compared to, lots of black and brown faces that you have amongst the Fremen. So there's a stark contrast there visually and then also through the dialogue as well.
Mm-hmm. Rad, what about you? What's your take on this?
Yeah, no, first of all, I want to address that, I think that subversion was there in Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes.
I don't think Denis is doing anything I don't think he's succeeding Lawrence of Arabia in any way when he lands on this final note that feels like triumphalism tripwired with kind of a cynical sense of deflating sense of defeat here. Our moral compass is broken is basically where the movie lands. So I think absolutely he nails it. I think he nails it because he was so true to his big inspo, which is Lawrence of Arabia. And by the way, I don't think I guess I mentioned that Lawrence of Arabia, I think, is the big kind of thing that shaped a lot of Denis Villeneuve's career, because you could see shades of that story also in Ensandis and Sicario and stuff, right? So that's why I say when he nailed that final note, when this becomes his masterpiece, it's because he has come as close as he could to the greatness that Lawrence of Arabia is.
Okay, so with all that in mind, I actually want to play you guys a clip of a show that just came out.
Do not be fooled by our politeness. Our bows are made of rituals. Death is in our air, and sea and earth. Just remember, we live and we die. We control nothing beyond that.
Okay, so that is from Shogun. Rad, I want to talk about this because that's a new series that drops today on Disney Plus. It's based on James Clavell's novel of the same name. It's set in feudal Japan in the 1600s. I want us to have actually a more fulsome conversation about Shogun at some point on the show, but it just felt like too perfect a parallel to sort of talk about Dune and Shogun in conversation with each other. Rad, do you want to talk about how they might be in conversation with each other?
Yeah, I mean, because look, like I was watching Shogun in the last week just as I was watching Dune, and there was this overlap of, these are both narratives about colonialism.
Yes.
These are both narratives with a white savior trope built into them, but both of these versions, both the Denis Dune movie and this version of Shogun is very resistant to that white savior trope, right? Because when you watch Shogun, like remember Shogun was adapted into a miniseries back in the 80s starring your mom's favorite crush, Richard Chamberlain. And it was very much stuck around in his orbit, whereas this one shifts the focus more to the Japanese characters, and this character that he plays is based on the first British sailor that lands in Japan, hoping to disrupt the kind of the Portuguese stranglehold on trade in that region. And so it's about this British sailor being once again an agent of the colonialists and their power plays, but the show's perspective is very much with the Japanese people and how they're using this would-be colonizer as a pawn in their own power plays, right? So I was really taken by the series, A, for kind of once again resisting certain tropes that was kind of built into the narrative, but also for, being this really rich interrogation of Japanese culture and history of that time.
Rachel, you and I are not as fancy as Rats. We haven't had as much time to see the rest of Shogun. But I think we should talk about this idea of these subversions of white savior narratives arriving now. I mean, like, we're only like a year and a half out from Avatar 2, man. And like, that was totally a Lawrence of Arabia movie. Like that was just that James Sully's character going around unifying the tribes. Like that was what Avatar 2 was. But now we seem to be sort of engaging in some of the subversions of these tropes. What do you make of these two in conversation with each other?
It's a really interesting comparison when it was like, go watch Shogun before this. I was like, why are we watching Shogun before this? Then I watched and I went, oh yeah, no, it makes perfect sense because it is. I have to admit, I had a bit of a bias against Shogun. I didn't know much about the novel or the miniseries before. I really did think it was just white guy lands in Japan and becomes fascinated with Japanese culture. I'm like, okay, that's like
we've seen this
college.
before. Yeah.
I mean, I see it with like people I went to university with. Like this is just what they do, and I was like, okay, whatever. But then you watch it, and it's a lot more nuanced than that. It's a lot more interesting. One of my favorite things in those types of is when they just speak English or when they just go like, "Why are you being so mean to me?" It's like, what if the Japanese just landed in England? Like, I don't think you guys would be all that happy about it. So I like that there was this kind of that it shows the divide. It shows the Japanese perspective, which Rad said. Like, I think that's what is often missing, even in white savior ones, because sometimes, like in Dune, we're looking at it from Paul's perspective. We're looking at his conflict, his internal conflict about it. But in Shogun, they actually just flip it around and say, well, what are the Japanese thinking about this? And what are they saying about this? Which I think is very refreshing.
Rad, when you think about these two in conversation with each other, first of all, there's a grandness of scale, right? There's sort of an epic sort of feel to both of these stories that you're watching. And I think we're kind of familiar with the epic as like something that we watch from like a white savior perspective. And so the idea of like employing these methods, I mean, like Shogun is being compared to Game of Thrones here, employing these like sort of visual cues to tell these stories. How are you thinking about the grand epic, scale of these stories?
Well, I mean, like, first of all, the Game of Thrones comparisons are obvious. I made the comparison myself because, like, this is addictive appointment viewing television where it's got this propulsive kind of energy between like the sex and the carnage and the betrayals and all the backroom dealings. But in terms of like the lusciousness of it, but my thing is like I do feel like Shogun is just, in my opinion, is aspiring for something more. I think it's aspiring to do right by this history and the authenticity of this culture. Like, and so in my review, I compare like what they're going for to being like a Kurosawa samurai epic with shades of like Scorsese's Silence, because there's this negotiation of the brutality of this culture. And what I feel when I watch Shogun, I could feel the writer's room, which is made up of a lot of Japanese Americans, trying to like kind of grapple with their culture and grapple with the frustrating, brutal things in their culture. And that frustration really comes through. And that's what made it more fascinating for me.
I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to go watch Dune Part 2 because only you two have seen it. I have not seen it yet. Rad and Rachel, thanks so much for your time. You guys are the best. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, Rad Simonpillai is a regular on Commotion and a film critic for CTV's Your Morning. Rachel Ho is a freelance writer and film critic. You can find her Dune review and exclaim right now. Dune 2 opens in theaters on Friday. Shogun is streaming right now on Disney+. And that is it for the podcast today. Remember, you can listen to the show anytime you like, wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Elamin. See you tomorrow.